44 men, one toilet, 60 days with the sun blocked out by 200 feet of ocean. In the summer of 1942, that was a normal patrol for a German Type VIIC U-boat crew, and the boat itself was smaller than a Boeing 767. But the real math is worse than the length. Every one of those men slept, ate and worked inside a steel tube 50 meters long on the inside. And by the time the war ended, roughly 3 out of 4 men who ever wore that uniform would not survive it. Picture the inside first, because nothing about this story makes sense without it. A Type VIIC ran about 67 meters overall, but the part the crew actually lived in, the pressure hull, was closer to 50 meters. Strip out the diesel engines, the electric motors, the torpedo tubes, the batteries and the fuel bunkers, and what's left for 44 to 52 men to eat, sleep and exist in is roughly the footprint of a suburban house, minus most of the walls. There was no dining hall. There was no rec room. There wasn't even a bed for everyone. That last part surprised even the men who signed up for it. Most volunteers for the U-boat arm were young. Some barely out of school, drawn by better pay, a smarter uniform, and the branch's early reputation for glory, before the losses caught up with the myth. Recruiters rarely mentioned the smell. Training took months, drilling the same emergency dive procedures over and over until a man could find his station in the dark, half asleep without thinking, memorizing the location of every valve and switch he might need to reach blind if the lights failed mid-attack. None of it fully prepared them for the boat itself. A U-boat carried more torpedoes than it had places to put them. So at the start of a patrol, extra torpedoes got stored under the bunks in the forward torpedo room. And 6 beds simply didn't exist yet. The men assigned to them slept on the torpedoes. Coiled up next to 2,000 pounds of explosive, they'd close their eyes and try to sleep through the diesel hum. And only once those first torpedoes were fired did their actual bunks appear. And even then, their bunk wasn't really theirs. With a crew this size and a boat this small, there simply weren't enough bunks to go around. So the U-boat service ran on something the men called hot bunking. One sailor finished his watch, crawled into a bunk that was still warm from the last man's body, and slept until his own watch started again. Then he got up, and somebody else took his spot. A bunk in a U-boat was never empty and never cold, and for 2 months that was as close to a home as any of them had. Officers got one small exception. The captain kept a bunk of his own, screened off by a curtain instead of a door, which was the closest thing to privacy that existed anywhere on the boat. You'd think, at least, that the air would be free. It wasn't. The boat ran on diesel engines on the surface and electric batteries underwater, and both left their mark on everything. Diesel fumes soaked into the walls, into the food, into the men's clothes, until the crew had a name for their own rations: diesel food, because a tin of meat opened 3 weeks into a patrol tasted exactly like the engine room smelled. Below decks, with 50 men breathing, sweating and cooking in a sealed tube, the air thickened fast. Men noticed it first in small ways. Matches wouldn't light, cigarettes wouldn't catch. Water condensed on every cold surface until the crew called it boat sweat, and it dripped onto bedding, onto instruments, onto the men themselves through the long, submerged hours. The engine room was its own separate misery. Running at full power on the surface, the 2 diesels could push the boat past 17 knots. But they also turned that compartment into an oven, with reported temperatures climbing well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit and staying there for hours. Men worked shifts down there in soaked coveralls, deafened by machinery loud enough to drown out shouted orders, and when the watch ended, they climbed forward into air that felt almost cold by comparison. Off-duty, some of them would linger near the engine room anyway. In winter, because it was the one warm place on a boat that spent most of its life somewhere near freezing. For most of the war, the fix for bad air was the same as the fix for a dying battery. Every night, weather and enemy aircraft allowing, the U-boats surfaced. Lookouts climbed to the bridge and clipped themselves to safety lines so a rogue wave couldn't sweep them into the Atlantic. The diesels roared back to life, drove the boat forward and fed the batteries their charge for the next day submerged. While the intakes pulled in air, a man could actually breathe. It was the only time in 24 hours the crew could smoke on deck, feel wind that wasn't recycled through 100 other lungs first, and see stars instead of rivets. Late in the war, a snorkel let some boats draw air and run diesels while still underwater, trading that nightly breath of freedom for a little more safety from aircraft that had gotten very good at finding a surfaced hull in the dark. Winter in the North Atlantic added its own layer of punishment on top of everything else. Waves broke clean over the bridge, soaking the watch crew even inside their oilskins, and with no way to properly dry anything below decks, men simply stayed wet for days. The boat pitched and rolled hard enough that moving through it meant bracing with both hands. Cooking meant holding the pot down as much as stirring it, and sleep meant wedging yourself into a bunk so the next swell didn't throw you onto the deck plates. Lookouts came off a 2-hour bridge watch in January, soaked through and half frozen, and the only place to warm back up was below deck's air that was already thick with everyone else's breath, so a man traded one kind of misery for another every time he climbed down the ladder. Water was rationed almost as hard as the air. Fresh water on board was for drinking, not washing, and on the longest patrols even that got thin, because one of the ballast tanks sometimes got pressed into service holding extra diesel instead of water, stretching the boat's range at the cost of its crew's thirst. Bathing simply stopped happening. Men went 3, 4, sometimes 6 weeks without touching soap to their skin. Beards grew in wild and uneven. The same undershirt sat against the same body for a month at a stretch, because there was nowhere to wash it and, most of the time, nowhere dry to hang it even if there had been. Then there was the toilet. A Type VIIC had exactly one working head for its entire crew, because the second one, the one nearest the galley, usually got packed floor to ceiling with cans of food the moment the boat left port. There simply wasn't anywhere else to put 6 weeks of provisions on a submarine this size, so the crew traded a bathroom for a pantry and lived with the consequences. Picture 50 men, one toilet, and a boat that could suddenly dive, roll, or shudder from a depth charge at any second of the day. The mechanics of it were its own kind of misery that nobody wrote home about. Food told the same story in reverse. It started decent. Fresh bread, eggs, real vegetables, even fruit for the first few days out of port, because nobody had figured out how to keep produce fresh inside a sealed, humid steel hull. They never really did. Within a week or two, the bread grew a fine green fur of mold, and the crew learned to slice it off and eat what was underneath rather than throw the loaf away. Eggs went next, then anything that wasn't in a can. By the back half of a long patrol, dinner was tinned meat, dried potatoes, hard biscuit, and whatever coffee was left, eaten standing up in 10-minute shifts because there wasn't room or time for the whole crew to sit down together even once. Meals were the only real break in a schedule cut into 3 8-hour watches, one on duty, one on standby for emergencies, one trying to sleep in a bunk that belonged to somebody else an hour ago. Boredom sat underneath all of it, and it was its own kind of enemy. Weeks could pass with nothing on the horizon but grey water. Men played cards on upturned crates, read the same handful of paperbacks until the spines gave out, and gathered around a wind-up gramophone in the radio room to play the handful of records someone had smuggled aboard, until everyone on the boat could recite the lyrics from memory. Letters from home, when a boat made it back to port to collect them, were read and reread until the paper wore soft at the folds. None of it filled the hours. It just gave the men something to hold on to between the moments that actually mattered. None of that discomfort stayed purely physical for long. Doctors who examined U-boat crews after long patrols noted men who'd stopped sleeping properly, even when they finally had the chance, jumping at ordinary engine noises, snapping at friends over nothing. There wasn't a name for it that the Kriegsmarine used openly, and there wasn't much of a system for treating it either. A man who couldn't hold himself together risked being seen as a liability by the crew he depended on to keep him alive. So most of what today would be called trauma got buried instead of treated, carried quietly from one patrol into the next until either the war ended or the man didn't. But the food and the smell and the crowding were survivable. What made the U-boat service the deadliest posting in the entire German military was what happened when someone found you, and what it felt like the moment your own boat became the hunter instead of the hunted. By 1942, Admiral Karl Dönitz had his U-boats hunting in wolfpacks, groups of submarines spread across a convoy's likely path and converging once one boat made contact. It was devastatingly effective early in the war. A successful attack usually happened at night, on the surface, where a U-boat's low silhouette was nearly invisible to a convoy's lookouts, and its diesel speed let it outrun anything but a destroyer. The captain would work the boat into firing position between two rows of merchant ships, call out bearings, and send a spread of torpedoes into targets sitting low and loaded in the water. Then came the run. Engines pushed hard, trying to put distance between the boat and the escorts now turning toward the flash of the explosions. It also meant longer patrols, further from home, chasing convoys that took weeks to intercept, and longer still to escape from once an escort ship picked up a contact. A depth charge attack didn't sound like an explosion in a movie. It started as a distant metallic click, the sound of a hydrophone operator on an Allied destroyer somewhere above locking on to the engine noise. Then the propeller beats overhead, growing louder, closer, directly above the hull. Then silence, the worst sound of all, because it meant the charges were already falling, and there was nothing left to do but wait. When they went off, the whole boat rang like a bell struck from the inside. Light bulbs shattered, cork insulation rained off the walls. Men grabbed anything bolted down and held on while gauges spun and paint flaked off overhead in sheets. Captains would take the boat as deep as they dared, sometimes past the manufacturer's advised limit of around 100 meters, occasionally reported as deep as 150, chasing a layer of colder water that could bend sonar and hide them from the hunters above. And then it was a waiting game, measured in hours, not minutes. Engines off, motors at bare minimum, every man ordered to stop moving, stop talking, because a dropped wrench or a badly timed cough could be the sound that gave away the boat's position. The boat's own hydrophone operator sat with headphones clamped on, tracking every propeller beat overhead and calling out changes in a whisper, the only voice anyone was allowed to hear. Some crews sat like that for 6, 8, 10 hours at a stretch, breathing air that was getting worse by the minute, listening to their own hearts because it was the loudest thing left to hear. That's the part civilians rarely picture, not the torpedoes going out, but the crew going quiet, sealed in the dark, waiting to find out if today was the day the pattern of explosions finally walked close enough. Accounts from crews that survived a heavy depth charging described the strange calm that settled in after the first hour, once the panic had nowhere left to go. Men counted charges out loud in their heads, learned to guess distance from the delay between the click and the blast, and some later said the boat's own creaking under pressure scared them worse than the explosions themselves, because a hull groan meant the sea itself was pressing in, charges or no charges. And if a boat did go down under attack, there was rarely a second act to the story. A submarine, crushed at depth or ripped open by a direct hit, gave its crew seconds, not minutes. Escape gear existed on paper, but at real combat depths, in cold Atlantic water, in the dark, most men who went down with their boat stayed with it. Survivor accounts from crews that did make it to the surface describe a handful of shivering men in a rubber raft, watching oil and debris spread across the water, where 40 or 50 of their crewmates had been moments before. By 1943, the odds had turned hard against the ones still going out. Allied radar, sonar, and long-range aircraft closed the gaps a U-boat used to hide in, and patrols that had once felt merely brutal started feeling close to suicidal. Out of roughly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm across the war, close to 30,000 never came home. That's a death rate somewhere around 3 in 4. The highest of any branch in the entire German armed forces, higher than the infantry, higher than the Luftwaffe's bomber crews. Men who volunteered in 1940, knowing the danger, were, by 1944, watching entire flotillas of friends simply stop returning to port, one boat at a time, with no wreckage and no explanation, just a name that quietly disappeared from the assignment board. And still they went back out. Some believed in the cause they'd been told they were fighting for. Some were terrified of what refusing would cost them at home. Most, by the accounts that survive, simply did the job in front of them, because the alternative was letting the men next to them go without a full crew. Whatever the reason, they climbed back down that hatch, into the mold and the diesel stink and the hot bunks still warm from someone else's sleep, and went back under. When a boat did make it home, the return itself was its own kind of strange. A U-boat coming back into a French or Norwegian pen after 2 months at sea was met with a band on the dock, fresh flowers for the captain, and a hot meal waiting on solid ground. A jarring contrast for men who'd spent 60 days rationing water and scraping mold off bread. It rarely lasted. Most crews had only a few weeks before they were back on a boat headed out to do it again, because the war needed replacement tonnage faster than it needed rested sailors. Some men developed small rituals before departure. A particular boot pulled on first, a coin kept in a pocket. Nothing that could actually change the odds, but something to hold on to while the lines were cast off and the pen disappeared behind them. Mail waiting on the dock was often weeks or months old by the time a boat picked it up. Letters written before a wife or mother had any idea whether the man reading them was still alive to open the envelope. And men learned to read old news as if it were current, because it was the only version of home they had. So when you picture a U-boat crossing the Atlantic in 1942, don't picture the sleek grey hull cutting through waves on a movie poster. Picture 44 men who hadn't bathed in a month, eating mold-scraped bread, standing up, taking turns in a bed that was never actually theirs, and listening every single day for the sound of propellers they couldn't see. 60 days like that, if they were lucky enough to make it back to port at all. What's strange is that most of them would have told you it wasn't the fear that broke men on a long patrol. The fear came in sudden bursts you could survive by holding still, counting the seconds between explosions. It was the waiting that wore men down, sitting on you for weeks in the dark, in the smell, in the silence between depth charges, with nothing to do but wonder if this patrol would be the one where the propellers overhead didn't fade away. 3 out of 4 of them found out the hard way. So what kept the other one, in 4, climbing back down that hatch, patrol after patrol, once they'd already seen what the sea could do to a boat like theirs?